Welcome to Presidential Fight Club, the show that answers the question, if all 44 presidents fought each other one-on-one, who would win? Hosted by two history professors who have too much time on their hands, Scott Rank and James Early. Welcome to the semifinals. We saw Lincoln victorious over William Henry Harrison. Now we're going to look at the final fight before the finals. That is Gerald Ford versus James Garfield. James, would you tell us about Ford?
Gerald Ford. Well, you covered most of it in the earlier match that Ford fought in. As Scott pointed out, Ford has a reputation, at least has had, maybe that's being corrected now, but Ford for a long time, people thought he was very clumsy because he fell down the steps on Air Force One, and he had a couple other mishaps. And of course, he was parodied by Chevy Chase. Chevy Chase was always pretending to be Ford and falling down. But Ford is actually one of the most athletic presidents we've ever had in our history. Scott pointed out that he was a standout football player, both in high school and in college. He had a reputation for attention to detail and athleticism, and also he could take blows to the head like nobody else, which of course football back then, I mean, football today is tough and it's brutal, but back then it was even worse. As Scott pointed out, it's more like rugby. People didn't have much padding. You didn't wear a face mask. Back in those days, your nose was your face mask, so you had to be tough. People were always getting injured, and sometimes people even died. Well, of course, that sadly still happens today, but Ford was really good. He had smarts as well as a great physical ability, especially in football. He could tackle people very well, played mainly defense. He was so good at football that he was actually offered a pro contract by not one, but two teams, the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers. So he could have gone on to be a football hero, and who knows, he might be in the Football Hall of Fame today, but he didn't want to do that. He went to law school instead, and later, of course, followed into politics. He was 6 foot tall, about 190, so good size. He was recruited to be a boxing coach when he was in law school, I believe it was, or maybe it was as an undergrad, even though he did not even ever box himself very much. I guess he probably learned a lot about it, though. So even though he didn't have a long career as a boxer, like somebody like Theodore Roosevelt, I'm sure he hit the books and learned how to do it. I mean, if you got to learn something, there's no better way than to teach it, right? You got to become an expert. So he knew how to fight. And as Scott also pointed out, he had a very distinguished career in World War II. His ship was under attack, and he held on a ship was about to tip over, and he held on by his foot, and he got back onto the deck and served very courageously in the Navy in World War II. So Ford has it all. I mean, he can tackle, he can bring you to the ground, he can box you, even though his boxing ability may be more theoretical. He knows that he'll put it into practice, and he's just one tough customer. He's courageous. He has no fear. So Ford brings a lot to the fight.
Okay, so going up against Ford is Garfield, men separated by a huge gap in time, but they have a lot of similarities. Now, they're about the same size, first of all. Both are about 6 feet tall. Garfield was about 185 when he was president, Ford 195. Ford was in the military, as James said. Garfield fought in the Civil War. He was a major general, led the Ohio Infantry Brigade at the battles of Shiloh and Corinth. He was a chief of staff for General William Rosecrans at the Battle of Chickamauga. And then he leaves the Army to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. So that's his military background. In terms of his time as president, we don't have a lot to say about it. He's assassinated 4 months into his first term. What he does try to kick off is go after the spoils system. This is really what the government is all about in the late 19th century, where the government is about kickbacks. You give jobs to those who are close to you. They, in a sense, owe you a favor. You grant federal projects, public projects to people that are your friends so you can skim off the top. Garfield was trying to reform all of that. And eventually he got it in the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, but it was mostly taken on by his successor. So he shot And doctors try to save him. They use a primitive metal detector, which they didn't realize that the table he was on was metal, so it's going off all the time. And they carve him up like a turkey, and he survives for 80 days like this. So definitely knows how to handle pain. As James mentioned, he's one of our most intellectual presidents. He was ambidextrous. He could write Greek with one hand and Latin with another. That means he's a southpaw in this fight. Boxers will tell you the advantages that southpaws have. Those who are trained to fight in one style can switch it up. So if he's going against an opponent that doesn't have great boxing knowledge, then that gives him an advantage. Although Garfield, as far as I'm aware, does not have any boxing knowledge, so you also have to take that into account. As James mentioned, quite strong. He could juggle clubs that weighed about 50 pounds. Born in a log cabin, didn't know anything about his father. All he knew about his father was that he was an accomplished wrestler. An accomplished frontier wrestler is really basically a show of strength where you're practically trying to grapple and shove the other person to the ground. So he has the genetics of a fighter. And he got into a lot of scraps as a child and made fun of for not having a daddy around. So he has experience fighting, putting that to good use. So for Garfield, what you have is somebody who has experienced pain in extensive levels, who can have flexibility when it comes into the fight, mixing up his fighting stances, has a genetics for a fight, has experience, maybe not formal training, but he's been into a bunch of scraps, and the psychology to be able to withstand it is what he can do when he faces off against Ford. But is that enough? James, who wins?
Well, the voters in American History Fanatics selected GERALD Ford over Garfield. So Garfield had brought a lot. It was a close fight, but in the end, that superior athletic ability and the ability to take pain, actually both of them could, of course, but Ford just had a slight edge.
And we haven't said built Ford tough here, so I guess that's a credit to us not being super gimmicky. But yeah,
yes, we had a lot of good memes shared, and we had one person who was in particular a big fan of Ford, and we got a lot of Ford tough memes.
Yeah, so I don't know the relationship to Henry, but yeah, so we'll throw that around depending on how gimmicky we want to be, because we're going to be seeing him again in the finals, and that is Lincoln versus Ford. Thanks for listening to Presidential Fight Club. If you'd like to download your own printable bracket sheets for each regional tournament so you can guess how the tournament will go, check out presidentialfightclub.com. We'd appreciate it if you could rate and review us on Apple Podcasts as well. Thanks for listening, and may you fight with the stamina of Teddy Roosevelt, the courage of George Washington, and the reach of Abraham Lincoln.